Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Monday Night Review. Before I decided to make this a podcast, it was just going to be kind of writings on Patreon, and this was the first one I ever wrote, I think. Maybe Hinton Ampner was the first one, but I'll admit I hadn't heard of this before last year, having grown up precisely 4.32 miles away from the Hampshire village of Tichborne, and being a lifelong lover of all things weird, I was outraged that my mother had not told me about this as soon as I appeared from the womb. We were driving past the beautiful Tichborne house, and I asked who was living there. And she told me the story that I'm going to tell you today. So today we're going to talk about the story of the Tichborne Claimant. Sounds weird, is weird. That's what we're here for. So, what or who was the Tichborne Claimant? Well, it's a case from the 1860s. It caused quite a stir and went as far as Australia, Paris. Lots of people were involved. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it all first. I should say that the Tichborne family has its fair share of weird stories, which I could go into today, but I'm not going to go into, including a woman on her deathbed having to crawl around the grounds in order to secure tax breaks for the people of the village. But today we're going to talk about Roger Tichborne, who was born in 1829. He's the heir to the Tichborne baronetcy, the fortune, and most importantly, the spanking house that goes with it. And he was in love with his cousin. This wasn't his first problem. Roger had been born with a deformation of the genitals, which apparently was hereditary, which meant that during his childhood in France, he was forced to wear frocks until he was 12 in the hopes that it would sort itself out, which it didn't. His uncle, the incumbent baron, disapproved of Roger and the incestuous romance. So Roger joined the army, and when it turned out they wouldn't be posted overseas, he left the army and boarded a ship bound for South America. The agreement being that if they still wanted to get married after 3 years apart, they could. So off he went to South America, where he has the dashing picture taken that I will share on Instagram and Facebook. And while he was there, Kitty, his beloved, married someone else. Roger, of course, had a manservant with him, and it proved to be a really good correspondent whilst travelling for the first 10 months. He wrote letters to his aunt and his mother frequently. His manservant, John Moore, became ill, and so Roger carried on alone, going on hunting trips and crossing the Andes and sending regular letters home. In his last letter, he told his aunt that he was in Rio and awaiting a ship to take him to Jamaica. The Bella would sail on the 20th of April, 1864. On the 24th of April, the capsized wreckage of the Bella was found off the Brazilian coast. Some cargo was found, but no bodies were, and it was assumed that everyone on board had died. There are sharks in that area, I think. It's one of my most heebie-jeebie things is being on a shipwreck. Absolutely horrendous. The Tichborne family were told of the news, but they were given a glimmer of hope by rumours circulating that a ship bound for Australia had picked up some survivors from the wreckage. But there was no word from Roger. In 1862, Sir James Tichborne died, and Roger, if he'd been alive, would have become the 11th Baronet of Tichborne. However, the title went to his younger brother Alfred, who was, as younger siblings tend to be, I am one myself, a bit of a rogue. He spent all the money, and the incredible house had to be rented out, and in fact he died at the age of 27 from his bad habits and left his young wife pregnant with her first child, which I'm not sure would have been a terrible outcome for her from the sounds of it. However, Roger's mother, as I'm sure most mothers would, held on to the idea that Roger was somewhere in Australia, and having been encouraged by a clairvoyant, placed an advertisement in the Times, and then in a series of Australian newspapers with the help of Arthur Cubitt and his Missing Friends agency. Sounds suspicious? I think so. Roger Tichborne was described in these advertisements as of a delicate constitution, rather tall, with very light brown hair and blue eyes, and she offered a very nice reward for any news of him. So, of course, news of him she got. In 1866, a lawyer from Wagga Wagga identified Thomas Castro, a bankrupt butcher, as her son. How was he identified? Well, during his bankruptcy hearing, he alluded to being entitled to property in England and talked of surviving a shipwreck. Stranger still, he smoked a pipe with the initials RCT. Though it took some persuading, he reluctantly agreed that he was Roger Tichborne, and from then on he became known as the Claimant. I'd like to take this moment to say that Roger Tichborne, when he was last pictured, looked like a thin, blue-eyed, well-dressed dandy. The Claimant, pictured 20 years later, looks like a fat, raddled fan of food, but after years of lockdown, I'm not here to judge. The Claimant and his lawyer decided to travel to England, funded by Lady Tichborne, and before travelling, Thomas Castro had to write a will, leaving everything to his mother, i.e. Lady Tichborne, whose name he got wrong. All mentions of his life as Roger Tichborne pre-shipwrecked were vague at best, but Lady Tichborne, in mourning for the loss of her younger son Alfred, accepted him as her lost child. In Sydney, the first leg of his journey, the Claimant met two previous employees of the Tichborne estate, both of whom, after some persuasion, recognised him as Tichborne, although one later changed his mind. The other stuck to his word until his death. The Claimant and his lawyer arrived in England in 1866, and what does Thomas Castro do? Run to the arms of his beloved mother? Well, he tries, but she's just nipped over to Paris. So he deposits his family in a hotel in London and goes to Wapping to inquire after the Orton family. They had left the area, and the Claimant now identified himself to a neighbour as a friend of Arthur Orton, who was, allegedly, very rich and successful in Australia. Aren't we all? Finally, in December, he went to stay in Alresford, which is the next village to Tichborne, and stayed at the Swan Hotel, where the landlord commented on his resemblance to the Tichborne family. In January, the Claimant went to Paris, where Lady Tichborne accepted him as her son on sight, settled £1,000 a year on him, which is £19,788 in today's money, and took him to meet the rightly suspicious Tichborne family. Now, today we have DNA testing, social media, and all that jazz. It seems totally weird to me that it wasn't clearer cut at the time. It seems totally bogus that Thomas Castro was Roger Tichborne, but more on that later. At the time, he gathered a lot of supporters, including the family lawyer, and when submitted to a medical, he displayed the same genital deformity as Roger Tichborne, though this is not verified anywhere, and to me it's something it probably wasn't greatly discussed in the 1870s. Lots of people, including his former batman, claim to recognise him, and sometimes he had interestingly accurate recollections of things from his, or Roger's, childhood, including the type of fishing tackle he used, though in an era where you can order anything from Amazon to arrive the next day, and there are so many options on everything, I wonder how many options on fishing tackle there were and whether he just made a lucky guess. However, apart from Lady Tichborne, Roger's mother, the rest of the family remained unconvinced, and I'm with them. One thing that really stood out for them and me is that the Claimant couldn't speak one word of French, Roger's first language as a child. He grew up in Paris. Now, I can't speak very much French, despite learning it for 10 years, but I can muddle through and I can understand it. He couldn't understand it at all, bearing in mind he lived there until his early teens. There were several other gaps in his memory, such as his inability to recall any of the contents of a sealed package he left before his departure to South America. The case went to court. People were sent to search records in Australia to find out if Thomas Castro's history checked out. It didn't, and he was identified as Arthur Orton, who he'd claimed to work and travel with when he first went to Australia. One witness recalled that when he first arrived in Wagga Wagga, the claimant had said he'd trained as a butcher in Wapping. So who was Arthur Orton? A butcher's son, born in Wapping in 1834, making him 5 years younger than Roger Tichborne. He had gone to sea as a boy and arrived in Tasmania in 1852. After being dismissed in a dispute over wages, there's no further trace of Arthur Orton nor Thomas Castro. The claimant puts this down to their illegal doings. Most of Orton's family, when they were tracked down, didn't recognise him as their relative, though it turns out he had bribed some of them. Arthur Orton's former girlfriend did identify him, though. When Lady Tichborne died, his funds dried up, or would have done had his supporters not set up the Victorian equivalent of GoFundMe, which kept him in a nice house in Alresford and allowed him to take up the position of chief mourner of his mother. But a failed trip to South America to find supporting witnesses lost him quite a lot of support. Without his backers, he quickly became bankrupt, but his legal team, in a last-ditch attempt, sent up the Tichborne bonds, which raised a further £40,000, which tided him over until his case finally came to court in May 1871. The case was Tichborne versus Lushington, who was the current incumbent of the Tichborne house. It's such a lovely house, did I mention that? The real crux of the matter was to discover whether the claimant was Sir Roger Tichborne. The case trundled on and was quite boring, really, so I'm not going to go into it here, but eventually it turned out that Roger Tichborne had distinctive tattoos that the claimant did not. I mean, this would have been one of the first things I'd have checked if I was his mother. The jury rejected his claim, not just based on the tattoos, but they helped. He was arrested for perjury and sent to Newgate Prison in March 1872. Really wouldn't want to be going to Newgate Prison. But the claimant didn't give up there. He appealed to the good nature of the public, and for many, his claim was seen to symbolise the plight of the working classes to get justice in court. It worked, and he was bailed in April 1872. There was another trial, one of the longest heard in an English court, going on for a phenomenal 188 days and drawing a lot of attention. Even Mark Twain turned up. That's obviously how you spend your holidays in London in the 1870s. After all that, it took just 30 minutes for the jury to decide that the claimant was not Roger Tichborne, and he was indeed Arthur Orton. He was committed to 2 consecutive 7-year sentences for perjury. He was still popular with the public, and it seemed he was admirable and interesting by virtue of being both working-class hero and legitimate baronet, despite it being proved that he wasn't the legitimate baronet. The claimant was released after 10 years in 1884, having maintained the entire time that he was Roger Tichborne. Eventually, for a small fee, it was not that small, it was £100, he confessed to being Arthur Orton in a newspaper and used the money to open a tobacconist shop, which failed, as did his other businesses, which included going on the stage until interest in him completely waned. After retracting his admission to being Arthur Orton, he maintained that he was Roger Tichborne until his death in 1888 of heart failure. It says Roger Tichborne on the brass plate on his coffin. He had a pauper's burial, but on his coffin, the plate says Roger Tichborne. Now, it was said that the family allowed this to happen, but actually there's no legal... you can have whatever you want written on your coffin, in the same way that you can have whatever you want written on your tombstone. So why is it not as clear-cut as it seems, with the power of hindsight and modern technology? Well, there is the family resemblance. A lot of people saw it and indeed pointed it out before knowing who he was. This led some to believe that Orton's mother, Mary Kent, was the illegitimate daughter of Roger Tichborne's grandfather, or indeed his father, which would make Roger and Arthur half-brothers. Orton's daughter maintained that her father confessed to killing Arthur Orton, and that's why he was cagey about his life in Australia, and he was Roger Tichborne. She continued to maintain her father was Roger Tichborne until her death in 1926. She even was arrested for violence against the family for trying to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The fact that he had the RCT pipe is also a bit weird, but we don't ever get told what and even if Roger had a middle name, so it's not that suspicious, I suppose. There's nothing on whether this was actually his pipe. Also, if you can get things secondhand, it could just be a coincidence. I also find the genital deformity, which was unusual and hereditary to the family, quite interesting. They obviously checked it, and the fact that he had it is unusual. So I wonder, and there were in my research ways that Orton's mother, Mary Kent, could have been the illegitimate daughter of one of the Tichbornes. I cannot for the life of me remember what it is, but there was a link there. So I wonder if perhaps he was a sort of illegitimate son, bad apple, went to Australia, and the family resemblance happened to crop up at the right time. For me, it's the French, though, that does it. How he could not remember any French. He doesn't talk much about the shipwreck, and obviously going through a massive trauma or being in the sea for a long time can affect your memory, but it seems very odd to me that he can completely lose what was originally his first language. And someone who travels the world, proving to be quite the correspondent, then post-shipwreck just doesn't bother writing anymore. Seems really odd as well. Surely you would want to let your family know that you were safe, even if you were deciding to stay in Australia. That just doesn't add up for me. So I'm sure that Arthur Orton is not Roger Tichborne, but it would be so interesting if there was a way that they could do DNA to see if he was in fact a relative of the Tichbornes. Slightly surprised they haven't done it. But there you have it. That's the story of the Tichborne Claimant. It just would be so easy to solve now, wouldn't it? If someone popped up, which I'm sure they do all the time, claiming to be the long-lost relative. But it was a huge, newsworthy, big deal at the time that's never sort of been resolved, despite the fact that obviously 2 juries have decided that he is Arthur Orton. There are things that remain unexplained. Genital deformity, the likeness, the fact that people recognised him. And I'm discounting his mother in that, because I think a mother's grief will possibly allow her to accept him because she hopes it's her son, but tattoos don't disappear. So it obviously wasn't him, but he must have been some relation or had some insider knowledge somewhere. So who was the mole? It's a fascinating story. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I love to hear from you, so always feel free to send an email to themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. Remembering it's REVUE, and you can come and find us on Instagram and Facebook, where we're at the Monday Night Review. And until next week, stay safe, be kind, and always check the back seat before you drive.